Hi everybody and welcome back to a new episode of Diagnose Dan. Today we're working on a 2012 Volkswagen Polo with a mighty 1.2 liter 3-cylinder petrol engine. The customer complaint is that the engine is running very poorly, it has no power, and currently it doesn't even move under its own power, and that's why it was towed into our workshop. The story is that this car was at another workshop. They replaced a lot of parts, serviced the engine, but that didn't resolve the issue. Then that workshop claimed that replacing the timing chain might resolve their issue, but replacing a timing chain is quite an expensive repair, so the customer wanted a second opinion to see if the timing chain is actually causing their issue. So that's where we are right now. So let's see if we can diagnose this one together. When we pushed the car into the shop, I noticed that the battery was very weak, so I quickly hooked up a battery charger. Now, in the next step, we're going to confirm the customer complaint. And when the customer complaint is confirmed, we're going to use the scan tool to see if there are any relevant fault codes stored. We're inside the car. Let's see if we can confirm the customer complaint. Now, I already hooked up the dongle, so we can check for fault codes later. And this car has got, let's zoom in, 179,800, oops, let's turn on the ignition, 179,803 kilometers. Now, let's start it up. And it actually started right up. We can see we do have got a check engine light. Now, let's rev it up a little bit. But actually, revs up pretty nice, but I can assure you, we tried to drive it into the workshop and it had absolutely no power. So let's rev it up a little bit more. And there it died. So I guess that's customer complaint confirmed. When I started the engine and revved it, it actually looked like it was doing just fine, but you got to take my word for it. And that's, of course, also the customer complaint. When we try to drive it into the workshop and the engine is under load, it won't rev past idle. It has got absolutely no power. Also, when I revved the engine and released the throttle, the engine immediately died. And that's, of course, not supposed to happen. Now, I did a quick scan of the vehicle, and there are actually 3 fault codes stored in the entire car. One in the gateway, and that's for the radio. But there is actually an aftermarket radio fitted in this vehicle. We also got a fault code for the airbag. And I don't know if you noticed, but the airbag light is on, and that's for a faulty control module. But that's not why the car is here today. It's here for the engine fault. And there is a fault code stored in the engine, the P0016 crankshaft camshaft correlation. And that fault code indicates or suggests there's actually something wrong with the timing of this engine. Now, at this point, it does look like we have got a timing issue since we have got a timing fault code stored. Now, a lot of vehicles use an hydraulic tensioner for the timing chain and have got variable valve timing, and this all works on oil pressure. Also, when there is something wrong with the chain, we need to make sure this is not because of a lack of lubrication. So the first thing I want to do is a very easy test, and that's checking the oil pressure. Checking the oil pressure is very easy on this engine because the oil pressure sensor is right there. So at this point, we're going to remove the oil pressure sensor, hook up a pressure gauge, and look at that oil pressure. So I removed the oil pressure sensor, or oil pressure switch, I should call it, and I hooked up an oil pressure gauge to that port. So let's start up the engine and let's take a look at that oil pressure reading. So let's fire it up. There we go. And at idle, we've got an oil pressure of somewhere between 3.5 and 4 bar. And that actually looked like a good number to me. So at this point, we can rule out an oil pressure issue. One of the simplest things you can do when you suspect a timing issue is, when you got one available, hook up an in-cylinder pressure transducer. First of all, because it's very quick. It probably took me less than 10 minutes to hook up this pressure transducer. All I had to do is to remove a ignition coil and a spark plug and installed the pressure transducer into that cylinder, and then hooked up the pressure transducer to my Pico and eventually hooked that up to a laptop. Now, when the timing of the valves is off, that clearly has an effect on the breathe-in of this engine. When the timing is off, this engine also won't breathe in correctly. Now, by catching an in-cylinder waveform, we can actually analyze the waveform and see if this engine is breathing correctly and if the timing is off. Everything is hooked up and the scope is running, so let's start up the engine to catch that in-cylinder waveform. Now remember, this is only a tiny 3-cylinder engine, and since we removed the ignition coil and spark plug, it will be running on 2 cylinders now, but it doesn't have to do that for very long, just long enough to catch that in-cylinder waveform. Now let's take a look at the waveform we have just captured. Now at the end of the exhaust stroke, so when the cylinder is still moving up, we can see a hump in the waveform. And that hump means the pressure inside the cylinder is increasing. Now, if the pressure inside the cylinder is increasing at the end of the exhaust stroke, that can only happen when both valves are closed. Now, this is something we don't want to happen because we want all the exhaust gases out of that cylinder. So we want the exhaust valve to be open until the exhaust stroke has reached top dead center. So that's not happening because the exhaust valve is closing before we reach top dead center, and that means the exhaust valve is closing early. So this definitely indicates we have got a timing problem. Another thing we can quickly do to confirm our timing issue is to take a crank cam correlation waveform. So what we can do is take the signal from the crank sensor and the cam sensor, catch that in a waveform and compare the timing to a known good one. I hooked up channel A to the crank sensor, which is behind the engine right there, and I hooked up channel B to the cam sensor. Now, although this engine has got 2 cams, only one cam, the inlet cam, is monitored, so there's only one cam sensor. Now, both sensors are Hall effect sensors. The scope is running, so let's start up the engine and let's catch that waveform. So let's fire it up. There we go. And let's pause the scope and let's compare our waveform to a known good one. Now let's take a closer look at that waveform. We can see that in between the missing notch on the crankshaft and the falling edge of the signal on the camshaft, on our signal, there are 22 teeth in between those 2 signals. Now I went into the Pico library and there was actually a known good waveform for this particular engine. On that waveform, we can see that in between that notch and the falling edge of the camshaft, there are 29 teeth. So we definitely have got a timing issue. The quick measurements we just took gave me enough evidence to be 100% sure we have got a timing issue. And for me, this justifies investing more time getting to the root cause of this issue. So in the next step, I want to remove the timing cover to see what's mechanically going on with the timing of this engine. So I removed the timing chain cover and actually had to remove some of this other stuff to get some of these bolts that go around this cover. Now actually, it wasn't too bad of a job at all. And with the timing cover removed, this is our setup. We've got 2 camshafts, and on this particular engine, we don't have variable valve timing. So very basic. We've got 2 chain guides, and over there, we've got a chain tensioner. Now at the bottom, we've got a second chain that runs to an oil pump. Now before we continue, let's quickly do some research. Let's dive into DDTSB. Let's select the car we're working on just simply by entering the license plate number. And after that, let's enter the fault code we have got. And when we do so let's select the car and let's enter P0016. And immediately the system comes up with a bulletin. When we take a look at the bulletin, it doesn't only tell us that a stretched chain on these models is quite common, but it also gives us some key information to quickly determine if we've got a stretched timing chain. When a chain stretches, the slack in the chain needs to be filled up by the tensioner. The tensioner needs to travel further out to compensate for the slack in the chain. Now, the program actually provides us with the travel of a tensioner on a known good engine. On a known good engine, the travel of the tensioner is about 12 millimeters. It also gives us an example of a known bad engine. On that engine, the travel of the tensioner was 18.5 millimeters. Now let's determine the travel of the tensioner on our engine. Now remember that the travel of the tensioner on a known good engine should be around 12 millimeters. Now let's measure the travel on our tensioner. And that's over 24 millimeters. That means that the travel of our tensioner is almost double, or it is double, of what it is supposed to be. So that's stretched timing chain confirmed. Hopefully I showed you that with the right tools, the right measurements, and the right information, confirming a stretched timing chain or a timing problem in general isn't that time-consuming or hard at all. Now I'm going to call the customer with our findings, and hopefully he lets us fix the issue. If he does, I will come back to you and I will show you the fix. Hi everybody, welcome back, and I'm test driving the Polo right now. I called the customer and he gave us the go-ahead on replacing the timing chains because there is actually two. There's a separate chain for the oil pump, and of course we didn't just replace the chains, we also replaced the guides, the tensioner, the gears, the oil seals, everything, and it's driving perfectly right now. Now when we were doing the in-cylinder pressure test, we could tell that the exhaust valves were closing early. But we couldn't do a cam-crank correlation based upon the exhaust cam because the intake cam is the only one with a cam sensor. Now, when we were mechanically timing the engine, there are timing tools that you log into the back of the cams, and they should line up with holes in the cylinder head. When we did that, we could see that the exhaust cam was actually way worse than we had measured on the intake cam. That cam had actually jumped. It was very advanced. Now, luckily, there's no engine damage and it's driving perfectly right now. So let's go back to the shop and let's redo those measurements and take a look at what they look like right now. I took the car for a 20-minute test drive and it's driving absolutely fine, and it's got enough power for a mighty 3-cylinder again. Now, after the repair, I cleared all the fault codes and I want to see if anything came back after the test drive. So let's scan the engine control module again. And there is actually a fault code stored in there, but it's for lost communication with the restraints control module and no longer a timing fault. Now, I guess I need to explain that. When I called the customer that the timing chains needed to be replaced, he also asked me to take a look at the airbag light. I did, and that turned out to be a faulty control module. So I removed the control module, got the part number, ordered a new one, but it isn't in yet. So right now there is no airbag computer installed. That's why we got a code for lost communication with the restraints control module. In the next step, let's catch that crank cam waveform again, and let's compare it to a known good we found in the Pico library. I got one channel hooked up to the crank sensor, the other one to the intake cam sensor, since there is no exhaust cam sensor. And by the way, here on the workbench, I've got all the parts replaced during the timing job. So the guides, the chains, all the gears, and of course, a new tensioner. The engine is running, but of course, we still have got that airbag light. But as I told you guys, I'm working on that. Now let's pause the scope. And let's analyze our newly captured cam crank waveform. As you can see, our captured waveform now matches the known good I found in the Pico library. This only tells us that our intake camshaft is timed correctly. It doesn't tell us anything about the exhaust camshaft because that camshaft doesn't have a cam sensor. So the next step, let's do another in-cylinder pressure test, and let's see if we got rid of that rising pressure at the end of the exhaust stroke. I've got the in-cylinder pressure tester installed, and it's only a 3-cylinder, so it's running rough on 2 cylinders right now. Let's not keep it running too long. Let's capture this waveform and let's take a closer look at it. Now let's compare the in-cylinder waveforms from before and after the repair. Before the repair, we had a rise in pressure at the end of the exhaust stroke, meaning the exhaust valves were closing early before the end of the exhaust stroke, while the cylinder was still moving up, and this caused a rise in pressure. The exhaust valves were closing early, meaning the cam was advanced, and that was exactly what we found during the repair. Now, after the repair, we no longer have that rise in pressure in that area, meaning the exhaust valves no longer close early, and the timing of our exhaust cam is now spot on. I hope this video demonstrated that ruling out or confirming a timing issue using the right tools doesn't necessarily need to be a very time-consuming or hard thing to do. Now, although in the end the other workshop was right, the failure was caused by a stretched timing chain, I think they should have tested instead of just throwing parts at the car, because these kind of repairs generally don't come cheap. Now, I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please subscribe to my channel, and when you hit the little bell, you will get a notification each time I upload a new video. And remember, diagnose then, fixed it again. See you next time, guys. Is that the engine is running very, and that's to take a fine. Now, after in the next step, let's catch that In the next step, let's catch that crank. In the next step, let's catch that crank. In the next step, let's catch that crank cam. What that 3 cylinders can deliver.